Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Oklahoma. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1917, Oklahoma was experiencing the transformative chaos of the oil boom. Black gold had been discovered beneath the red soil, and fortune seekers poured into previously isolated communities, bringing prosperity and problems in equal measure. The rural landscape, once dominated by scattered farms and cattle ranches, now bristled with oil derricks and the makeshift camps that surrounded them. It was against this backdrop of rapid change that one of the most disturbing discoveries in Oklahoma history would unfold. On September 23, 1917, a team of oil surveyors from the Marland Oil Company was mapping potential drilling sites along Owl Creek, approximately 12 miles southwest of Pawhuska in Osage County. The team, led by Chief Surveyor Robert Hutchinson, had been working their way through the rolling hills for 3 days, following geological indicators that suggested oil deposits beneath the surface. According to Hutchinson's field notes, preserved in the company archives, they came upon the Watson farm at approximately 2:30 inches the afternoon. The property consisted of a 2-story farmhouse, a large barn, several outbuildings, and what appeared to be an extensive storm cellar built into a natural hillside. The surveyors noted that despite the harvest season, no smoke rose from the chimney, no livestock moved in the paddocks, and the fields showed signs of recent neglect. Hutchinson would later testify that what struck him most was the absolute stillness of the place, as if even the birds avoided flying over the property. Following standard procedure, Hutchinson sent 2 of his men, William Garrett and Joseph Menendez, to request permission from the property owners to survey the land. The men returned after 20 minutes, reporting that despite repeated knocking and calling out, they had received no response from within the house, though they noted that the front door stood slightly ajar. More troubling, Menendez reported seeing what appeared to be dried blood on the porch steps, though Garrett insisted it might have been rust from the water pump. Concerned by these observations and mindful of the increasing lawlessness that had accompanied the oil boom, Hutchinson decided to report the situation to the authorities in Pawhuska. Sheriff William Bradshaw, a veteran lawman who had served in the Spanish-American War before returning to Oklahoma, arrived at the Watson property the following morning with 2 deputies. What they discovered would launch an investigation that would consume the next several months and reveal horrors that defied comprehension. The first indication that something terrible had occurred came not from inside the house, but from the barn, where Sheriff Bradshaw noticed an unusual number of carriages and automobiles in various states of disrepair, far more than a single family would need. The Watson family arrived in Osage County during the spring of 1912, purchasing 160 acres of farmland along Owl Creek from a widow eager to return east after her husband's death. Thomas Watson, then 42 years old, presented himself as a cattleman from Kansas seeking better grazing land, though subsequent investigations could find no record of him in any Kansas county. He was described in the land deed as a man of medium height, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that local merchant Harold Morrison later characterized as watchful, like a man expecting trouble. His wife, Margaret, 10 years his junior, made even less of an impression on the community, rarely venturing into town and speaking so softly. When she did that, shopkeepers had to lean close to hear her requests. The couple's most distinguishing feature, however, was not their reticent nature, but their 3 sons, identical triplets, who had already reached the age of 17 when the family arrived. Ezra, Elijah, and Enoch Watson, were a source of immediate fascination and unease in the community. Born on April 3rd, 1895, according to a family Bible later recovered from the farmhouse, the triplets were so perfectly identical that even close acquaintances struggled to distinguish between them. They dressed alike in dark clothing, moved with an unsettling synchronization, and rarely spoke to anyone outside their family circle. When they did speak, witnesses reported, they often completed each other's sentences or spoke in unison, creating an effect that Sarah Holbrook, the local schoolteacher who encountered them at a town gathering, described as most unnatural and disturbing to witness. The community's initial reception of the Watson family was cautiously welcoming, as was typical for newcomers who appeared to have means and caused no immediate trouble. Thomas Watson paid cash for his land purchase and initial livestock, establishing credit at Morrison's General Store and the Farmers' Bank of Pawhuska. However, this welcome cooled considerably after several peculiar incidents involving the triplets. During a church social in June 1912, the three young men were observed standing in a perfect triangle formation in the corner of the room, silently watching the other attendees for the entire duration of the event. When Reverend John Whitfield approached them to make conversation, all three turned their heads in perfect unison to stare at him, causing the Reverend to later confide to his wife that he had never felt such a chill as when those 6 identical eyes fixed upon me. More disturbing were the reports from neighboring farms of livestock disappearing, always in groups of 3 to 3 chickens, 3 piglets, 3 calves, with no trace of predators or thieves. When questioned, the triplets would provide alibis for each other, with responses so perfectly matched that Sheriff Bradshaw's predecessor, John Hammond, noted in his journal that it was as if they had rehearsed their stories, or perhaps shared one mind among the 3 of them. The discovery of oil in Oklahoma transformed the landscape both physically and socially between 1912 and 1917, where once isolated farms might see a visitor every few weeks. The roads now carried a constant stream of roughnecks, speculators, equipment haulers, and fortune seekers. The Osage Nation's mineral rights had made many wealthy overnight, and the resulting boom brought thousands of outsiders into previously quiet communities. The Watson farm, situated along what became a major route between Pawhuska and the newer oil fields to the west, found itself no longer isolated, but at a crossroads of commerce and ambition. Thomas Watson had shown remarkable foresight, or perhaps suspicious foreknowledge in his land selection, as the property sat perfectly positioned to serve as a way station for travelers. By 1915, he had erected a hand-painted sign at the road's edge, advertising fresh water and rest for weary travelers, and converted a portion of the barn into makeshift lodgings. The triplets, now 20 years old, took primary responsibility for this new enterprise, while their parents remained largely invisible to visitors. The first reports of missing oil workers began to surface in the autumn of 1915, though initially these disappearances drew little official attention. The oil fields were dangerous places where men routinely vanished due to accidents, claim jumping, or simply moving on to better prospects without notice. However, a pattern emerged that would later prove significant. Workers who mentioned staying at or passing by the Watson farm seemed more likely to disappear than others. Frank Dobson, a driller for Prairie Oil and Gas, told his crew chief in October 1915 that he planned to rest at the Watson place on his way to Tulsa. He never arrived. James McCarthy, a pipeline surveyor, was seen by multiple witnesses heading toward the Watson farm in November of that same year, but failed to report to his next job site. The triplets' interaction with these newcomers followed a disturbing pattern. according to those who survived their hospitality. Travelers reported that the three brothers would appear simultaneously, moving with an unnatural coordination that suggested rehearsal or supernatural connection. They would offer water from their well, which they claimed had special properties due to mineral deposits, and suggest that weary travelers rest in the barn. Those who accepted the offer and lived to tell about it described an overwhelming sensation of being watched, even when alone, and reported that the triplets would take turns checking on them throughout the night, though the brothers insisted they had all been asleep. Marcus Wheeler, the traveling salesman whose disappearance in March 1917 would help trigger the investigation, had confided to a colleague before his final journey that he planned to avoid the Watson farm, despite its convenient location, saying, "Those three boys look at a man like he's livestock being assessed for slaughter." Marcus Wheeler had been traveling the Oklahoma Territory for Drummond Supply Company for 6 years, selling everything from barbed wire to patent medicines to the scattered farms and booming oil camps. A meticulous man by nature, Wheeler kept detailed records of his routes and appointments in a leather-bound journal that he mailed to his wife in Oklahoma City at the end of each month. His entry for March 19th, 1917, preserved in the Oklahoma Historical Society archives, reads, "Must pass by the Watson place tomorrow, though I dread the necessity. Those three brothers watch a man like spiders watching a fly. Will not stop, regardless of the hour." This would be his final entry. Wheeler's established routine involved a circuit from Oklahoma City through Pawhuska, continuing west to the Burbank field before returning via Ponca City, a journey that typically took 12 days. When he failed to return by April 2nd, his wife Clara contacted his employer, who initially assumed Wheeler had extended his trip to pursue promising leads. However, when subsequent inquiries revealed that Wheeler had never arrived at his scheduled appointments beyond Pawhuska, concern deepened into alarm. James Patterson's disappearance 3 weeks later would finally force authorities to acknowledge a pattern they had been reluctant to see. Patterson, a surveyor for Prairie Oil and Gas Company, was known for his reliability and precision, having mapped dozens of potential drilling sites across Osage County. On April 15th, 1917, he left Pawhuska with instructions to survey a section 10 miles west of town, a journey that would take him directly past the Watson farm. His assistant, Carl Hendricks, was to meet him at the site the following morning, but found no trace of Patterson or his distinctive red Maxwell automobile. Unlike the transient oil workers who might vanish without immediate notice, Patterson's absence was noted within hours, prompting a search that would yield disturbing results. His vehicle was discovered 2 days later, abandoned in a ravine 4 miles past the Watson property, but Patterson himself had vanished without trace. The initial response from local authorities reflected the chaotic nature of the oil boom period, where law enforcement was stretched thin and disappearances were often attributed to the numerous hazards of frontier life. Sheriff John Hammond, who preceded William Bradshaw in office, had been reluctant to investigate what he termed grown men who choose to leave without saying goodbye, particularly when those men were outsiders with no local family to raise complaints. The county commissioners, more concerned with managing disputes over mineral rights and preventing claim jumping, saw little reason to allocate resources to tracking down travelers who might have simply decided to seek their fortunes elsewhere. This institutional indifference might have continued indefinitely had not Sheriff William Bradshaw, who assumed office in January 1917, brought a different perspective shaped by his military experience and natural skepticism of coincidence. Those fortunate enough to survive encounters with the Watson triplets provided testimonies that painted a deeply disturbing picture of the family's hospitality. George Brennan, a tool salesman from Tulsa, gave a sworn statement to Sheriff Bradshaw in May 1917, describing his overnight stay at the Watson farm the previous autumn. I arrived near dusk with a broken axle, and the three brothers appeared before I could even call out, as if they had been waiting behind the barn watching the road. They moved together, like they were connected by invisible strings, turning their heads at the same moment, stepping in unison, even blinking seemed coordinated. When one offered to help with my vehicle, the other two spoke the same offer a half-second later, creating an echo that made my skin crawl. The meals offered to travelers became a recurring theme in survivor accounts. Dorothy Chen, one of the few women to stay at the farm and live to describe it, traveling with her husband who was purchasing mineral rights for Standard Oil, recalled the dinner served to them in September 1916. The meat had an unusual sweetness to it, not unpleasant but unfamiliar, and when I asked what it was, all three brothers answered, "Local game," in perfect unison. They watched us eat with such intensity that my husband and I found ourselves unable to finish despite our hunger. Throughout the meal, I had the strangest sensation that we were being evaluated, like livestock at auction. The feeling of being constantly observed emerged in every survivor testimony. Robert Hutchinson, the oil surveyor who would later discover the abandoned farm, had stopped there for water in June 1917 and reported, "Even when I could see all three brothers in front of me, I felt eyes on my back. They spoke of their parents, but I never saw them, only heard movements in the house above. When I glanced at windows, curtains would twitch closed." The brothers stood in a triangle formation around me as I drank from their well, and I had the distinct impression they were waiting for something to happen. The locked storm cellar, built into the hillside behind the main house, featured prominently in these accounts as a source of particular unease. William Garrett, who survived a night at the farm in early 1917, testified that he had been awakened by sounds from beneath the ground, like metal on stone, rhythmic and purposeful. When he asked about the cellar the next morning, the triplets had exchanged looks before Ezra, or perhaps Elijah, as he could never distinguish them, replied that it was where they stored their winter provisions and meat processing equipment. The door was secured with 3 separate locks, which seemed excessive for a root cellar, and I noticed dried brown stains on the stone steps leading down that they made no effort to explain. The official record of Thomas and Margaret Watson's deaths, filed with the Osage County Clerk on December 18th, 1916, lists the cause as influenza, though no physician's signature appears on the document, only that of the county coroner, Edgar Hampstead, who noted that he had been summoned to the property 2 days after the deaths had occurred. According to Hampstead's report, preserved in the county archives, the triplets had explained that their parents had fallen ill suddenly and expired within hours of each other, a circumstance that, while unusual, was not impossible given the virulent strains of influenza circulating that winter. However, several details in Hampstead's private notes, discovered among his papers after his death in 1923, suggest he harbored doubts about this explanation. The bodies showed signs of having been carefully washed and prepared, unusual for grieving children to undertake with such precision. More troubling was the complete absence of any evidence of illness in the home, no soiled bedding, no medications, no signs of the disorder that typically accompanies death by influenza. The 3 boys stood in their habitual triangle formation throughout my examination, watching with expressions that conveyed no grief, only what I can describe as anticipation. The funeral, held on December 20th, 1916, at the small cemetery outside Pawhuska, was attended by fewer than a dozen people, most of whom later reported feeling profoundly uncomfortable throughout the service. Reverend Whitfield, who presided, noted in his journal that the triplets had insisted on a closed casket ceremony despite the lack of any disfigurement from disease, and that they had arranged themselves around the graves in their characteristic formation, remaining motionless throughout his eulogy. Martha Goodwin, whose farm bordered the Watson property to the east, told Sheriff Bradshaw that she had seen Margaret Watson just 3 days before her reported death, and the woman had appeared in good health, even mentioning plans to preserve vegetables for the winter. The rapidity of the illness and death struck many as suspicious, but in the absence of any evidence of foul play and given the triplets' apparent cooperation with authorities, no investigation was pursued. The inheritance of the property passed smoothly to the 3 brothers, who at 21 were of legal age, and the substantial savings Thomas Watson had accumulated through his various enterprises provided them with financial independence. The changes in the triplets' behavior following their parents' deaths were noted by everyone who had dealings with them, where before they had been merely unsettling in their synchronized movements and speech. They now displayed what Harold Morrison described as a boldness that bordered on menace. They expanded their hospitality business, adding more signs along the road and even placing advertisements in newspapers as far away as Tulsa, promoting their farm as an ideal rest stop for weary travelers. Sheriff William Bradshaw formally launched his investigation on May 15th, 1917, after compiling a list of 17 individuals reported missing along the route passing the Watson farm over the previous 2 years. His military background had taught him the value of methodical documentation, and he approached the case with a systematic precision unusual for rural law enforcement of the era. His first action was to obtain a warrant to search the Watson property, citing the pattern of disappearances and the discovery of Patterson's abandoned vehicle as probable cause. The search commenced on May 18th with Bradshaw accompanied by 3 deputies and, significantly, a photographer named Edwin Morse who would document what they found. The barn yielded the first cache of evidence, hidden beneath loose floorboards in the hayloft, where Bradshaw discovered a collection of personal effects that would eventually be linked to 11 missing individuals. These items included watches, rings, identification papers, wallets, and in one particularly poignant case, a locket containing photographs of children who would never see their father again. The triplets' response to the discovery was more disturbing than any protestation of innocence might have been. They stood in their triangular formation, watching the search with what Deputy Carl Winters described as scientific interest, as if observing an experiment whose outcome they already knew. When questioned separately, a standard interrogation technique, their testimonies revealed an unsettling pattern. Each brother provided identical alibis for the nights in question, using precisely the same words and phrases, even including the same pauses and inflections. However, when pressed for details about specific visitors, their stories began to diverge in ways that suggested fabrication rather than faulty memory. Ezra claimed Marcus Wheeler had never stopped at the farm, while Elijah insisted he had stayed one night but left early the next morning, and Enoch maintained that Wheeler had passed by without stopping, but had spoken to them briefly about road conditions. These contradictions, rather than suggesting innocence through confusion, implied a calculated attempt to obscure the truth that had been imperfectly coordinated. The evidence of systematic activity became overwhelming as the search continued. In the house, Bradshaw found a ledger hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible that contained entries dating back to 1915, listing names, dates, and cryptic notations that appeared to indicate the value of items taken from each victim. More disturbing still was the discovery of detailed maps marking remote locations throughout Osage County, each marked with dates and numbers that Bradshaw would later determine corresponded to disposal sites. The federal government's involvement became inevitable when Bradshaw confirmed that several victims had been traveling across state lines when they vanished, transforming the case from a local matter to one of federal jurisdiction. Deputy U.S. Marshal James Corbett arrived from Oklahoma City on May 22nd, bringing with him resources and authority that would prove crucial as the investigation deepened into territories more horrible than anyone had initially imagined. The 3 heavy locks securing the storm cellar door required bolt cutters to remove, and Sheriff Bradshaw noted in his report that each lock was of a different manufacture and age, suggesting they had been added over time as the need for security increased. The wooden door, reinforced with iron bands, opened onto stone steps that descended into darkness, and even from the entrance, a peculiar odor emerged that Deputy Winters later described as sweetish and metallic, like a butcher shop that hadn't been properly cleaned. The initial descent revealed a space far larger than typical storm cellars, excavated deep into the hillside and reinforced with limestone blocks that showed tool marks, indicating the expansion had been done by hand over considerable time. Electric lights, unusual for rural properties in 1917, had been installed along the walls, and when Bradshaw found and activated the generator, what they illuminated caused hardened lawmen to stagger back in horror. The first chamber contained what could only be described as a processing facility, with metal tables, an array of knives and saws arranged by size, and most disturbingly, a mechanical meat grinder of industrial capacity. Along one wall stood glass jars filled with preserved materials that Dr. Helen Morrison, the medical examiner summoned from Oklahoma City, would later identify as human organs stored in a solution of formaldehyde and other chemicals. The systematic nature of the operation was evident in the labeled containers, each marked with dates and what appeared to be coded references to the victims. Deeper into the cellar, the investigators found what Deputy Marshal Corbett described in his federal report as evidence of long-term systematic murder on a scale previously unknown in the territory. 3 additional chambers had been excavated, each serving a specific purpose in what was clearly an established process. The second chamber contained human remains in various states of dismemberment and preservation, some stored in salt boxes, others hung from hooks like livestock in a slaughterhouse. The third chamber held what the Triplets apparently considered their collection, carefully preserved specimens that Dr. Morrison would determine had been selected for specific physical characteristics. The fourth and final chamber contained personal effects arranged with museum-like precision, creating a grotesque memorial to their victims. Dr. Helen Morrison's examination of the remains, conducted over 3 days with a team of assistants, revealed details that would haunt everyone involved in the investigation. Her official report, filed with both county and federal authorities, identified remains from at least 23 individuals, though she noted that the systematic processing made exact counts impossible. The preservation techniques employed showed sophisticated knowledge of anatomy and chemistry, with certain specimens prepared using methods typically found only in medical colleges. Most disturbing was her finding that the remains showed evidence of perimortem trauma, indicating that at least some victims had been alive during the initial stages of processing, with tool marks on bones, suggesting systematic dismemberment had begun before death occurred. The arrest attempt began at dawn on May 24th, 1917, with Sheriff Bradshaw leading a team of 6 deputies and 2 federal marshals to apprehend the Watson triplets on charges of multiple murder. According to the official report, the officers surrounded the farmhouse, and Bradshaw called for the brothers to surrender peacefully, but received no response despite lights being visible in the windows. After 30 minutes of silence, Deputy Marshal Corbett authorized forced entry, and what followed would be recorded as one of the most bizarre arrest attempts in Oklahoma law enforcement history. The officers found the triplets seated at the kitchen table in their characteristic triangle formation, fully dressed and apparently waiting, with 3 identical cups of coffee growing cold before them. They offered no resistance as they were placed under arrest, but witnesses noted that they moved in perfect synchronization even while being handcuffed, turning their heads as one to track each officer's movement. During transport to the Pawhuska jail, the arresting officers reported that the brothers remained silent, except for occasional whispers between themselves in what sounded like a private language or code. The decision to separate the triplets during incarceration proved both prudent and ultimately tragic, as Sheriff Bradshaw placed each brother in a different cell block to prevent communication and coordination. However, what occurred over the next 12 hours would demonstrate that physical separation could not sever whatever bond existed between them. Guards reported that despite being unable to see or hear each other, the triplets maintained identical schedules, sleeping, waking, and even requesting water at precisely the same moments. At 11:47 p.m. on May 24th, Deputy Marcus Cole discovered Ezra Watson dead in his cell, hanging from a torn strip of bedding, despite having been on suicide watch with checks every 15 minutes. The coroner would later note that the makeshift noose had been fashioned with surgical precision and that Ezra had somehow managed to break his own neck instantly, a feat requiring both knowledge and extraordinary determination. Within moments of Ezra's death being discovered, both Elijah and Enoch began screaming in their separate cells, not in distress but in what witnesses described as triumph or celebration. The chaos that followed provided the cover for an escape that investigators would later conclude had been planned from the moment of arrest. While deputies rushed to Ezra's cell and attempted to revive him, Elijah and Enoch somehow obtained keys to their cells, likely palmed during the arrest process and hidden until needed. Security procedures that should have prevented such an escape failed in a cascade of errors that suggested either incredible luck or inside assistance. Deputy Marcus Cole pursued the fleeing brothers into the darkness, ignoring Bradshaw's orders to wait for backup, and paid for his bravery with his life when his body was discovered 2 hours later in a ravine 3 miles from town, his throat cut with surgical precision, identical to the wounds found on victims in the storm cellar. Following the escape of Elijah and Enoch Watson and the death of Ezra, Sheriff Bradshaw commissioned a thorough investigation into the triplets' background, recognizing that understanding their origins might provide clues to their whereabouts and motivations. The research team, led by newspaper reporter Caroline Matthews of the Pawhuska Journal, uncovered disturbing patterns that stretched back to the brothers' earliest years. Sarah Holbrook, who had briefly served as schoolteacher in the small community of Burden, Kansas, where the Watson family had resided from 1903 to 1911, had maintained detailed journals that her daughter provided to investigators. The entries regarding the Watson triplets painted a picture of children who were deeply abnormal from their earliest interactions with others. They move as one creature with 3 bodies, Holbrook wrote in September 1903, when the boys were 8 years old. During arithmetic lessons, if one makes an error, all 3 make the identical error at the same moment, even when seated separately. When I attempted to keep them apart to encourage individual development, they became catatonic, sitting frozen until reunited. More disturbing were her accounts of other children's reactions to the triplets, with multiple incidents of classmates becoming violently ill after sharing lunch with them, and several pets belonging to students disappearing after the Watson boys showed interest in them. Previous incidents in other counties began to emerge as investigators cast a wider net, revealing a pattern of disturbances that followed the Watson family's movements across Kansas and Oklahoma. In Maple City, Kansas, where the family had lived briefly in 1901, newspaper archives revealed that 3 children had disappeared from neighboring farms over a 6-month period, cases that remained unsolved but ceased when the Watsons departed. In Conway Springs, their next residence, local cemetery records showed an unusual number of graves that had been disturbed between 1,000 1,902, and 1,903, with authorities at the time attributing it to wild animals despite the systematic nature of the disturbances. The pattern that emerged suggested the triplets had been engaged in aberrant behavior from childhood, protected and possibly encouraged by parents who moved frequently to avoid consequences. Financial records uncovered by federal investigators revealed that Thomas Watson had no documented employment history, yet always possessed sufficient funds to purchase property and establish businesses in new locations. Bank records from institutions across Kansas showed deposits of cash that coincided with disappearances in those communities, suggesting the family had been profiting from their crimes for at least 15 years before settling in Osage County. The investigation also revealed that the triplets had likely killed before their parents' deaths, with at least 3 confirmed victims between 1,913 and 1,916, whose remains were discovered in locations corresponding to maps found in the farmhouse, indicating that Thomas and Margaret Watson had not only known about their son's activities, but had actively participated in concealing evidence. The excavation of the Watson property following the escape revealed a network of tunnels that extended far beyond the initial storm cellar, suggesting years, if not decades, of careful planning and construction. Deputy Marshal Corbett, who had served in mining operations in Colorado before joining federal law enforcement, estimated that the tunnel system covered at least 2 acres underground, with passages reinforced by timber supports that showed varying ages of wood, indicating construction had occurred in phases over many years. The main artery extended from the storm cellar northward for approximately 300 feet before branching into 5 separate tunnels, each leading to different areas of the property, including one that emerged in the barn's floor through a cleverly concealed trapdoor, another that connected to the house's basement, and 3 that terminated in underground chambers whose purposes would become horrifyingly clear as the investigation progressed. The level of engineering involved suggested knowledge beyond what simple farmers should possess, with ventilation shafts disguised as fence posts and drainage systems that prevented flooding during Oklahoma's notorious spring rains. The processing room, discovered at the nexus where the tunnels converged, represented the dark heart of the Watson operation and provided evidence that their activities extended beyond mere murder for profit into realms that investigating officers struggled to comprehend or document. This circular chamber, approximately 30 feet in diameter, had been excavated with mathematical precision, its walls carved with symbols that Professor Eugene Whitmore from the University of Oklahoma would later identify as an amalgamation of various occult traditions, combined with what appeared to be a unique symbolic system developed by the Eugene Whitmore friend, and cries of the wave to dock time. Rue, Gon, 1-4 Ren. Rue, 7-2 Ra. Triplets themselves. The room contained 3 metal tables arranged in a triangular pattern, with channels carved into their surfaces that led to a central drain, while hooks suspended from the ceiling were positioned at specific points that corresponded to markings on the floor, creating what Whitmore described as a 3-dimensional geometric pattern that suggested both practical and ritualistic purposes. Along the walls stood shelves containing jars of preserved materials that Dr. Morrison's continued analysis would reveal included specific organs harvested from victims according to what appeared to be astrological or numerological significance, with labels indicating not only dates but planetary positions and numerical calculations whose meaning remained obscure. The artifacts discovered throughout the tunnel system suggested that the Watson triplets had developed an elaborate belief system centered around the number 3 and its supposed mystical properties, with every aspect of their operation incorporating this numerical obsession. Maps found in waterproof containers within the tunnels marked locations across Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas, and Missouri, with symbols matching those on the processing room walls, suggesting a network of similar sites that investigators would spend months attempting to locate, finding disturbed Earth and evidence of excavation at 17 locations, though no additional tunnel systems of comparable complexity. Anna Peterson's survival and escape from the Watson farm stands as the single most valuable testimony in understanding the full horror of the Triplets' operations, providing investigators with details that no amount of physical evidence could have revealed. The 22-year-old Norwegian immigrant had been traveling from Tulsa to visit her sister in Pawhuska when her automobile suffered a punctured tire near the Watson property on May 20th, 1917, just 4 days before the arrests would be attempted. Her account, given from her hospital bed where she recovered from her ordeal, provided a minute-by-minute chronicle of how the Triplets operated and the psychological torture they inflicted upon their victims. According to Peterson's sworn testimony, the three brothers appeared within moments of her stopping, approaching in their characteristic formation and offering assistance with a coordination that immediately set her nerves on edge. Despite her instincts warning against it, the approaching darkness and isolated location left her with little choice but to accept their help, though she insisted on remaining with her vehicle while they claimed to retrieve tools from their barn. What followed was a carefully orchestrated abduction that revealed the extent of their planning and experience. The Triplets returned, not with tools, but with a cloth soaked in what medical examination would later determine to be chloroform mixed with other substances, and despite her attempts to resist, Peterson found herself overwhelmed by the synchronized attack of 3 individuals who moved as one. She regained consciousness in what she would later identify as one of the underground chambers, bound to a chair with leather straps that showed wear from previous use. Facing the 3 brothers who stood in their eternal triangle, watching her with what she described as scientific curiosity rather than human emotion. Over the next 3 days, Peterson endured psychological torture that seemed designed to break down her sense of reality and self, with the Triplets taking turns speaking to her in their synchronized manner, sometimes completing each other's sentences, other times speaking in unison, creating a disorienting effect that made her question her own perceptions. They explained in clinical detail what they had done to previous victims, not as threats, but as if providing education, describing their belief that human consciousness could be extracted and preserved through specific procedures performed while the subject remained alive, and that the number 3 held the key to transcending individual identity. Her escape came through a combination of desperate ingenuity and the Triplets' single point of vulnerability, which was their absolute need to maintain their triangular formation during what they called significant moments. When they prepared for what Peterson understood would be her final night alive, arranging their tools and symbols in the processing room, she managed to partially free one hand from the worn leather straps and used a sharp edge on the chair to complete her liberation. While the brothers were engaged in their preparatory rituals, their attention focused inward rather than on their victim. The manhunt for Elijah and Enoch Watson expanded beyond Oklahoma's borders within days of their escape, as federal authorities recognized that the brothers' established pattern of movement and their apparent need to remain together would make them easier to track than individual fugitives. The first credible sighting came on June 2nd, 1917, when a rancher named William Harrington reported encountering 2 men matching the brothers' description near Amarillo, Texas, noting with unease that they moved in perfect synchronization and spoke to him in unison when asking for directions to the nearest town. Harrington's account was corroborated by his wife, who observed the encounter from their porch and later told investigators that the men's identical movements had made her physically ill to watch. as if witnessing something fundamentally wrong with natural human behavior. Over the following months, reports filtered in from across the southwestern territories of strange encounters with twin men who appeared and disappeared like ghosts, always together, never apart, leaving behind a trail of unease and, increasingly, death. The pattern of threes that had characterized the Triplets' crimes in Oklahoma continued with disturbing consistency across state lines, though the methods showed evolution and adaptation to new environments. In Clovis, New Mexico, 3 railroad workers vanished over the course of a single week in July 1917. Their disappearances initially attributed to the dangerous nature of their work, until investigators discovered that all 3 had mentioned encountering 2 strange brothers offering work at a remote ranch that no local could identify. Near Roswell, 3 members of the same family disappeared from their homestead, leaving behind a meal half-eaten and their youngest child hidden in a root cellar, too terrified to speak for days after being discovered. The federal investigation, now coordinated by the Bureau of Investigation in Washington, compiled reports from law enforcement agencies across 6 states, revealing a pattern of movement that suggested the brothers were following predetermined routes, possibly connected to the maps discovered in their tunnel system. Special Agent Harrison Fitzgerald, assigned to lead the manhunt, noted in his reports that the brothers seemed to possess resources and connections that allowed them to travel without leaving the typical traces of purchased tickets or registered vehicles, leading to speculation about a larger network of sympathizers or accomplices. Despite the massive allocation of resources, including wanted posters distributed to every post office and law enforcement agency west of the Mississippi, concrete leads evaporated like morning dew, with the brothers displaying an uncanny ability to vanish, just as investigative teams arrived in areas where they had been spotted. The investigation was further hampered by false reports from attention seekers and the genuinely disturbed, who claimed to have encountered the brothers in visions or dreams, creating a fog of misinformation that obscured genuine leads and exhausted investigative resources. The year 1952 brought an unexpected resurrection of the Watson case, when a construction crew working on the expansion of Highway 287 near Amarillo, Texas, unearthed a metal box buried 6 feet beneath what had been empty prairie. Foreman Michael Rodriguez reported the discovery to local authorities, when the box was found to contain human teeth, arranged in groups of 3, photographs of individuals who appeared to be deceased, and most significantly, a leather-bound journal bearing the initials E.W. on its cover. The journal, though damaged by time and moisture, contained entries in a precise handwriting that forensic analysts would later match to samples of Elijah Watson's writing found in Oklahoma. The entries, dating from 1917 to 1919, provided a window into the twisted philosophy that had driven the brothers' actions. Ezra's sacrifice was necessary but premature. One entry read, "The Trinity was broken before the work was complete. Enoch and I continue, but the balance is disturbed. We seek always the third to restore what was lost." Other passages made reference to the necessity of 3 in achieving what Elijah called transcendence through consumption, suggesting a belief system in which the ritualistic processing of victims served some perceived spiritual purpose. The discovery prompted a renewed investigation led by FBI Special Agent Robert Mitchell, who had studied the original case files as part of his training at Quantico. Mitchell's team exhumed several sites indicated in the journal, recovering remains that forensic anthropology confirmed as dating to the period immediately following the brothers' escape from Oklahoma. The pattern of injuries on these remains matched exactly those found in the Watson storm cellar, confirming that the brothers had continued their activities across state lines. More disturbing was the journal's references to establishing new processing sites and recruiting those who understand the necessity, suggesting the brothers had attempted to expand their operations beyond their original partnership. The investigation of the 1,970 seconds revealed a pattern of missing persons cases that bore disturbing similarities to the Watson methodology, though separated by decades and geography. In Portland, Oregon, 3 members of a commune vanished in 1971, with witnesses reporting visits from 3 elderly men who moved with unusual synchronization. In Sedona, Arizona, 1973 saw the disappearance of 3 hikers who had mentioned encountering 3 old brothers offering water at a remote trailhead. The most compelling case occurred in Austin, Texas, in 1975, when a University of Texas student named Rebecca Morrison survived an attempted abduction by 3 elderly men who she insisted moved as one entity despite their apparent age. Morrison's description of their synchronized speech patterns and triangular positioning exactly matched accounts from 1917, though she had no knowledge of the historical case. DNA evidence collection was still in its infancy during the 1,970 seconds investigations, and by the time modern techniques became available, most physical evidence had degraded beyond usefulness. However, genetic material recovered from beneath fingernails of one victim in the 1975 case revealed something extraordinary. The DNA profile suggested the attacker was suffering from an extremely rare genetic condition that occurs almost exclusively in identical multiples. Dr. Patricia Thornton, a criminologist at Rice University, became obsessed with connecting these modern cases to the Watson brothers after discovering the DNA anomaly in 1981. Thornton spent years compiling evidence that Elijah and Enoch had survived into old age, possibly recruiting a 3rd individual to replace Ezra and restore their trinity. Her research files, filling 17 boxes, traced possible sightings and similar crimes across 5 decades, building a compelling case that the brothers had adapted their methods while maintaining their core pathology. In March 1982, Thornton informed colleagues she had identified the current location of the surviving Watson brothers and planned to conduct surveillance before contacting authorities. She was last seen leaving her Houston apartment on March 15, 1982, and her vehicle was later found abandoned near Marfa, Texas, with her research materials missing and signs of a struggle. The psychological analysis of the Watson case has fascinated experts since the original crimes were discovered, representing a unique example of what Dr. William Forsythe termed triadic psychopathology in his seminal 1963 paper on the subject. The shared delusions exhibited by identical triplets presented a near-perfect storm of genetic predisposition and environmental reinforcement, with each brother's pathology amplifying and validating the others in an endless feedback loop. Traditional theories of shared psychosis, or folie à deux, proved inadequate to explain the Watson phenomenon, as these typically involve a dominant and submissive partner, whereas the triplets appeared to operate as co-equal participants in their delusions. The symbolism of 3 that permeated every aspect of their crimes went beyond mere obsessive-compulsive behavior, representing what psychiatric researchers have identified as a fundamental reorganization of reality around a numerical concept. Dr. Helen Cartwright's 1,978 analysis suggested that the triplets had developed a belief system in which the number 3 represented a form of completion or perfection that could be achieved through specific ritualistic actions, with their victims serving as unwilling participants in an elaborate supernatural framework that existed primarily in the brothers' shared imagination. Expert opinions on their methods have evolved as understanding of serial predator behavior has advanced, with modern analysts noting the unusual combination of careful planning and mystical thinking that characterized the Watson crimes. The nature versus nurture debate surrounding the case continues to divide researchers, with some pointing to the apparent genetic component suggested by their identical nature and shared pathology, while others emphasize the isolated upbringing and possible encouragement from their parents as environmental factors that shaped their development. The unresolved questions surrounding the Watson case continue to haunt researchers and law enforcement alike, with fundamental mysteries remaining despite decades of investigation. The circumstances of Ezra's death in custody raise particular questions, as the synchronicity displayed by the brothers throughout their lives makes a unilateral suicide decision seem unlikely, leading some investigators to speculate that his death was either murder, disguised as suicide, or part of a larger escape plan that required one brother's sacrifice. The true fate of Thomas and Margaret Watson remains equally mysterious, with exhumation of their graves in 1963 revealing that the coffins contained rocks and soil rather than human remains, suggesting the triplets had disposed of their parents' bodies elsewhere and staged elaborate funerals to maintain appearances. The total number of victims may never be known, as the brothers' travels across multiple states over potentially 6 decades created a trail of disappearances that cannot all be definitively linked to their activities. Current whereabouts theories range from the pragmatic suggestion that the brothers died of natural causes in the 1,980 seconds to more disturbing possibilities involving protective networks or even generational continuation of their practices. The question of who might have protected or assisted the brothers over the decades remains open, with evidence suggesting they possessed resources and connections that allowed them to evade capture for far longer than should have been possible for fugitive serial killers operating without support. The Watson farm property near Owl Creek remains abandoned to this day, with local authorities reporting that no buyer has ever successfully completed a purchase despite the valuable oil deposits beneath the land. Teenagers who dare each other to visit the site report consistent experiences of overwhelming dread and the sensation of being watched, though skeptics attribute this to the power of suggestion rather than any supernatural presence. Local folklore has incorporated the Watson story into a broader mythology of the region, with parents warning children about the 3 who move as one and the danger of accepting hospitality from synchronized strangers. The most persistent legend claims that on certain nights, 3 figures can be seen standing in triangular formation where the farmhouse once stood, though no photograph has ever captured this phenomenon despite numerous attempts. Unexplained disappearances continue to occur in the region at a rate statistically higher than comparable rural areas, with a peculiar pattern of victims vanishing in groups of 3, though law enforcement officially maintains these are coincidences rather than evidence of ongoing activity. The rule of 3 has become so embedded in local consciousness that many residents unconsciously avoid activities involving that number, from traveling in groups of 3 to scheduling appointments on dates divisible by 3, creating a cultural scar that persists long after the original wounds. This account has been compiled from official records, survivor testimonies, and decades of investigation into one of America's most disturbing serial killer cases, presenting facts as they are documented while acknowledging the many questions that remain unanswered. Readers are advised that while the Watson brothers were last reliably cited in 1975, the possibility of their survival into extreme old age or the continuation of their practices by others cannot be definitively ruled out. Those traveling through isolated areas of the Southwest are reminded to exercise normal caution regarding strangers, with particular attention to any groups of 3 individuals displaying unusual synchronization in movement or speech. The author takes no responsibility for the psychological impact of this information, but notes that knowledge of historical predators and their methods serves as valuable protection against similar threats. Remember that evil often wears a mundane face and offers kindness as bait, that isolation creates vulnerability, and that when intuition warns against accepting hospitality from strangers, that warning should be heeded, regardless of how harmless they might appear. Should you encounter 3 who move as one, who speak in synchronization, who watch with 6 eyes that never seem to blink independently, do not accept their offer of shelter, do not consume what they provide, and do not follow them to any secondary location, regardless of the emergency they might describe. The Watson case reminds us that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked, and some hospitality better left declined. For in the vast expanses of rural America, where help might be hours away and witnesses non-existent, the greatest danger often comes from those who seem most eager to assist. Let this account serve as both historical record and warning, a reminder that the capacity for coordinated evil, exemplified by the Watson triplets, did not die with them, but remains a possibility wherever isolation and madness intersect, wherever the bonds between individuals become pathological rather than loving, and wherever the number 3 appears with too much frequency to be mere coincidence. The story of Ezra, Elijah, and Enoch Watson stands as testament to the darkness that can flourish when multiple minds share a single delusion, when family bonds become chains that bind victims rather than love that protects them, and when the simple act of seeking shelter becomes an invitation to horror beyond imagination.